All right.
My screen says it's now streaming live on Facebook.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that's just on my personal page though. So welcome everybody. We have a little bit of technical problems tonight, and so I apologize. I don't think that we're live streaming on Vanishing Boise, but we will post it there when this is over. And of course, anyone can jump on the Zoom call and join us in the live discussion. So my name's Lori DeCare. I'm the founder of Vanishing Boise, and we have been doing these virtual live stream on Thursday nights through February, March, and now April. And tonight we're so lucky to have a special guest from Vancouver, British Columbia, Dr. Patrick Condon, who's going to speak to us tonight. And we have our normal co-host, Brian Ernst, who's a public interest attorney who's on the call and will be helping guide our conversation and facilitate the discussion. So welcome everybody. Today I'm just gonna talk about some ground rules. So I wanna remind everyone this is being live streamed. So be mindful as the recording is live on the Facebook page forever. And then I'm asking everyone to mute themselves when they're not speaking, and then work on keeping the background noise to a minimum. So next, I'm just going to do a short introduction to the topic and read a biography about Dr. Condon, and then he will speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll have an open discussion with Q&A at the end. So as Boise, Idaho chases housing affordability in a record-setting overheated real estate market, while it also undertakes a process to overhaul its long-standing zoning code, one of the most well-known urbanists from Vancouver, BC, Dr. Patrick Condon says not so fast. His hometown is the Canary and the Coalmine, proving that by simply adding supply by increasing density without sufficient affordability mandates has made Vancouver one of the most dense and expensive cities in the world. His hometown is the Canary and the Coalmine, proving that by simply adding supply by increasing. So, is it echoing for other people?
Not anymore.
Okay. He now questions many of the assumptions he formerly believed. After years of advocating for just building more supply by focusing on increasing density, Dr. Condon now says that we must intervene in a broken housing market, recognize the financialization and commodification of housing that is taking place, and insist on affordability. This will ensure affordable housing at the same time it dampens the hunger of land speculators for city land. He says that Boise's approach of upzoning and simply building more housing absent any valid affordability mandates is a futile exercise, and it perpetuates a false narrative of solving our housing crisis. Dr. Condon is a longtime professor of urban design at the University of British Columbia, a highly influential urbanist, popular speaker, and an author with noted works including 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities, Design Strategies for the Post-Carbon World, and his recently published book that's linked in the chat, Sick City, Disease, Race, Inequality, and Urban Land, where he discusses how most of the problems are rooted in the inflation of urban land value and the fact that land is no longer priced for its value for housing, but instead as an asset class in a global market hungry for assets of all kinds. Let's welcome Dr. Condon and thank him for taking time to join us to discuss what has worked and not worked in other cities in the US and Canada. Thank you, Dr. Condon.
Thank you, Lori. I'll put my slides up now. There we go. Hello, everybody. This discussion tonight, my part of it anyway, is basically about one simple thing. There are many great reasons to add new density, but increasing affordability may not be one of them. It certainly has turned out not to be one of them in Vancouver, where I've been lucky enough to work for the last 30 years, mostly on urban issues, working as an academic and working with our local communities in many cases. It doesn't appear to be the case in Boise, and it's not the case in a lot of US metropolitan areas, uh, particularly on the West Coast, in the Intermountain West where you are, and also especially on the very West Coast from Seattle to Los Angeles. For those who don't know me at all, which is all of you, I'm not a Canadian. I'm an American citizen. I grew up in Boston. I'm a New England Patriots fan, and I'm not going to make any excuses about that. But I got a job in Vancouver in 1992, where I've worked ever since. And since I got there in 1992, we have added 40,000 additional people in the downtown in buildings like the ones you're looking at. We have rezoned the entire city, first to allow secondary suites in every single family home. In both of these cases, prices continued to rise. We rezoned all of our arterial streets for 4-story residential mixed-use buildings, which are great, walkable, transit-friendly. A lot of good reasons, as I said, to do density, and they've been done in Vancouver, but prices still continue to rise. We even very recently, within the last 2 years, changed our citywide zoning to allow on every so-called single-family parcel, of which we have 60,000 individual single-family home parcels, so-called. You can now put 4 dwelling units on each. You can duplex the lot, and you can for each duplex, you can have a rental suite. You can also have a what we call lane houses. Some people call them granny flats on the rear alleyway. And prices continue to rise. In fact, during that same period where we've had all of these changes, many of which, until relatively recently, I was a strident supporter of for many reasons. A lot of them still good reasons. Densification produces less greenhouse gas, supports transit, a variety of other good things it does. Unfortunately, the evidence became impossible for me and others to ignore anymore, other urbanists, such as this chart, the brown line indicating wages controlled for inflation. So wages have stayed very flat. Vancouver, not too many people know, has the lowest average wages of any major city in Canada. At the same time, it has the highest housing costs, which the dark blue line indicates what has happened with housing costs, going from 250,000 to over $1 million on average during the period between 1976 and 2018, with the most exaggerated rise being between 2002 and 2018, with nary a blip during the so-called Great Recession. And the number 29 and 28 is the number of years it would take the typical 25 to 34-year-old to save the down payment required to get that average priced house. So obviously, nobody's going to be able to do that unless they have access to what we call up here, and maybe you call it the same thing, unless they have access to the bank of mom and dad to give them this 7-figure down payment that they will need by draining their own equity. So when the pandemic struck, like all of you, I was kind of stuck at home doing my classes on Zoom, which I'm sick to death of. And you probably are too. But out of frustration around many issues, the American politics in my home country being one of them, and the irony, nay, the tragedy of the pandemic, where we thought housing prices would collapse, 1 year ago. It turns out that across the United States and Canada, housing prices have increased somehow through some crazy magic by 25%. And that coincided with my frustration around what was obvious, that inequality in the United States, and we have it too in Canada, but this is a book that was especially directed towards my fellow Americans. Inequality in the United States was translating and is translating in mortality rates for Black and brown Americans, as well as people in the lower income categories, that were 4 times greater than they were for people who were generally more privileged. And in the case studies I analyzed in parts of Massachusetts, the small wealthy communities had infection rates that were only 1/10 of what they would be in adjacent lower income communities, like the one I grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts, for example. And it turned out through not that difficult examination, scholarly examination of the data, that what that really seemed to be the causal factor, of course, was income. Whether you were Black, brown, or young, income was the causal vector for disease, and how that was manifest was in locations, places where people were straining to afford homes were the places where the residents would have the highest levels of infection, both in their neighborhoods, often in their overcrowded homes, both and also by coming into contact with other ill people on their sidewalks or in their cafes, or when they were stocking the grocery shelves, or driving the taxi cabs, or driving the buses, which would be their jobs. It's the first time I've done a book and just kind of given it away. So that's why you have the link in the chat, so you can download it as we speak. If you want to have a physical book in your hand, you can certainly go to Amazon.com and you'll get it quite quickly. But that was the point of that was and is the point of this book: Sick City Disease, Race, Inequality, and Urban Land. And land ends up being the focus for it in ways that I will spend a fair amount of time talking about. Before I do that, I want to say that the subject of this book and my desire is not really about zoning per se, but zoning ends up being fundamental to a lot of what I'm talking about. My driving interest is inequality and the way that land price in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in England, pretty much in the entire advanced world, is becoming the vector not just for disease, but for exaggerated inequality. So this map is very interesting. It shows you land price, and it shows you where the concentration of high-priced lands are in the continental United States. And the redder it is, obviously, the more expensive that land is. But it's showing you that information by county. It's not really showing you the tremendous increase in the value of not all land. All land is not increasing in value. It's only urban land that is increasing in value. And this is a more accurate depiction because it shows you, it toggles back and forth between what is just the county-based information, and the other one expands that price basically to give you a literal view of just how much the entire value of United States land is concentrated in major urban areas. And dramatically, the West Coast is quite exaggerated in that respect. Basically have the Northeast Corridor, Florida, and the West Coast as the place where land value has gotten, well, quite literally out of control. $30 trillion worth just in the metropolitan areas for those who are interested in the number. And there it is, just that map frozen for you. And here it is, the two maps together. For you, in the Boise metropolitan area, in the Treasure Valley, it may not seem significant in comparison to other areas, but as we zoom in a little bit, relative to your own population, it is very significant. This change and this massive increase in the value of land of urban land in comparison to rural land. And urban land is really what concerns us when we're talking about housing price. A very interesting study, which is linked on the website, which is linked to the book, so you'll have additional access to information, is this one from the American Enterprise Institute. It's not a think tank I usually resort to, but this is the best analysis of what's going on with land prices. And what you're seeing here, if you look carefully on the upper right, is the change in land price between 2012 and 2019. And the redder it is, the closer it is for a 500% increase in just land value between those, in just those 7 years. This is a phenomenal transformation that has never really happened in the last 100 years, to be certain, to be sure. And it's very much concentrated in places that I think you all really care about. And of course, here's the Boise area right here. If you zoom in a little bit further, you see the dominant increase in land value in the Boise region is typically, certainly well over 100% and typically over 250% throughout the region. Now, it's important to emphasize this is an interesting study because it just looks at land value. This is not building value. This is land value separated out from so-called improvements. To help you understand, the problem isn't really the cost of the house. Buildings haven't, the price of doing a square foot of a building hasn't really increased that much. Well, until lumber doubled in price during the pandemic. But the cost of building a building hasn't increased anything near 100% even in the last 10 years, even after factoring for inflation. And it's not just, people say that part of what might be driving this is population increases in the Boise area. Yes, you do have dramatic population increases in the range of 3% a year, which are quite unusual, but what could possibly explain the fact that California, which just this year has started to lose population, has a similar increase with their own land prices increasing hundreds of percent. And what this map also reveals, which is quite tragic really, is that in the Los Angeles Basin area, most of that land price increases has been concentrated in the lower income areas of the metropolitan area, putting a very serious handicap for the people I'm talking about, which I think we're all concerned with, and the book is about, and it correlates with an increase in home purchase prices in those areas, as well as a dramatic increase in monthly rents for rental units within that California area. Point here being, this is driven by other things that are not associated with the amount of, I've made 2 points so far. In Vancouver, basically an almost doubling of density didn't reduce prices. And here, it appears that whether your population is increasing or decreasing, you're looking at land value increases that are impossible to justify or to even understand. Until you discover this fellow here, who is an American native who grew up in the California region and as a child of the West and very much a kind of prairie populist whose writing and work was largely confined to his short life, and his writings and his political activity were confined to a period between 1880 and essentially 1992 or 1892, excuse me. And he wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, which for 10 years was the most popular book sold to everybody in the United States. It outsold the Bible for at least 2 decades. And unfortunately, we've sort of forgotten this individual. And there's a variety of unhappy reasons that we have forgotten this individual. He's making something of a comeback. And if I can, in a small way, participate in his comeback, I'm happy to do that. Because he said something that explains this business of land price inflation. And while this land price inflation that I've just demonstrated for you here occurring in the United States over the past 7 years, the past decade, in dramatic fashions, seems new to us. It's not an entirely new phenomenon. It happened fairly recently in American history, as these things go, in the late 1800s, in what was known as the Gilded Era, when the wealthy were amassing enormous fortunes and wage earning classes were struggling to find adequate housing among their other deprivations. And that gave rise to what many people call the progressive period in American history, and many things came from the progressive period, including 3 constitutional amendments, including the constitutional amendment necessary to do the income tax. But the point of bringing this fellow forward is his book, Progress and Poverty, was written largely to make one point. And that point was that he claimed that the machinery of the economy was such that it would automatically, almost, take all the value of wage earners, of their work, and all the value of entrepreneurs, be they a cafe owner or a factory owner, generally called capital. So all the value of labor and capital would inevitably be drawn into the price of land up to the point where almost all the value of the worker's work would go into that value, manifest in the price of rent that you'd have to pay just to keep a roof over your head. Similarly, for the entrepreneur, their costs, particularly for their share of land opportunity in urban areas, would be constrained, and they would be pressured to the point, and he claimed, they would be pressured to the point where economic instability would occur. And we have a recent example of that in the 2008, a great recession where the speculative interests in, again, land, we call it real estate, but it's basically land, basically brought down temporarily, thankfully, but brought down the American economy. He's not the first one to say this. This idea of land absorbing all that value actually dates back at least to Adam Smith, the first great economist known for his enthusiasm for the magic of the marketplace. What's less known about Adam Smith, however, is that he also bemoaned the process by which all of that wonderful activity of capitalism ended up getting absorbed in the pockets of the landlords. And we listening tonight live in a period that's relatively new within the context of even my lifetime. I was born shortly after this chart initiates, 1950. And during a very long period, particularly the immediate post-World War II period, the economy of the United States was functioning in a way, for a variety of reasons that I won't get into, in a way that increases in productivity, the lighter line, were matched by increases in the real wages of goods producing workers, whoever they were, in whatever industry they were in. Until you get to the mid 1970s, when a gap opens up between the value, the purchase value, if you will, of all this stuff that's being made, is captured not equally by workers and business owners, but business owners end up getting the lion's share of that increased productivity value, whereas the real wage of goods producing workers stayed flat under those circumstances. And it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it wouldn't even be bad at all, but it's reflected in how all that extra value that went to the what we could call the investor class, or people who make money from having money, whether they're in the financial industry or they own stocks or they actually build a business on their own. But most of that is passively gained wealth. About half of that new value gap between this and this in the United States is going into urban land price. There's a tremendous appetite globally for assets of all kinds. Stocks are overpriced, gold is overpriced, Bitcoins are overpriced. But more dramatically than any of those, and the one that isn't often commented on, and poor Henry George would be rolling over in his grave as a consequence, is the price of urban land. And what really bothered Henry George and bothers me about that is it doesn't really matter to the average worker or wage earner what's happening in the stock market, as long as they can afford a place to live. So the flow of capital into urban land as an asset class and as something worth investing in, and in recent years a very safe investment, is harmful to people who don't have access to assets of their own and are unlikely to get them, and people who are in their 20s and 30s in America, unless they have access to the bank of mom and dad, are almost entirely within that category of people without access to capital. The influence on house prices throughout the United States has been fairly dramatic. The lower line here is non-inflation adjusted wages. So wages have gone up this much, but non-inflation adjusted house prices have at least doubled that amount in the period between 1965 and basically now. And that chart looks bad, but this chart looks positively horrifying. This is California, and that housing line I just showed you, the top line there becomes the bottom line here. That blue line showing you the average US median existing home price. But look at what happens in California. Big drop in 2008, but they've rebounded. Look what happens in San Francisco median house prices. A drop in 2008, but look at how ridiculous that price is. So this is not something that is universally applied throughout every metropolitan area in the United States, but certain unfortunate ones at the moment, and Boise would be one of those under current circumstances, have this exaggerated increase in real estate value, which is really not the price of the building, it's really the price of the land. And here's your numbers, which are scary in their own way. A doubling in just 10 years. I mean, even if you start before the 2008 a big decline that's still a doubling. So to make a very simple point, I've used this in a couple of lectures, and it's dramatically simplified, but that doesn't make it less compelling in terms of what the reality is. This is certainly the reality in Vancouver where I live, and it's probably a reality close to your own or something quite similar. What certainly happens in the Vancouver area after we have tried all these decades of increasing density, what we've discovered is that when we increase the allowable density, when we do that in the hopes that it will enhance affordability, based on the principle, well, if I just put four houses on that one lot that costs $1 million, then the land price for each house would only be $250,000, which was the philosophy that I was engaged with for many years, and most of my colleagues in the United States still are, I shouldn't say most, at least half of my colleagues in the United States still take the position that adding density will necessarily enhance affordability. What our experience here is, and I believe now that it's a fundamental way that the real estate market is operating, particularly in places that have the kind of housing stress that you're experiencing, is that when you rezone, the major beneficiary of that rezoning is the landowner. And often it's the professional landowner who has the capability and the insight and the knowledge to buy low and sell dear and make a fortune. So in Vancouver, most of our most successful developers make a certain percentage on building the building, but they make their largest percentage just in being in the land market early enough to capture an important set of parcels that will be in the future rezoned. They're very acute at understanding and following the politics at City Hall and watching what the trend lines are in the policy around the allowance to add additional density. Here's a point that it's very important for me to make. Going back to Henry George, he said the only way to get out of this fix was to tax land instead of income, to tax land instead of capital. So you wouldn't tax the factory and you wouldn't tax the laborer's income. You would just tax all the urban land that was underneath all that work and all that income, which is it's a great principle, and it almost was adopted by Congress in the late 1890s, but they never did. But so many people who espouse his theories these days say the same thing, and I understand that. But I think the politics of increasing a land tax to solve this problem is very dicey. I don't think it's going to happen during my lifetime, that's for sure. But what we do have is zoning. And what we haven't fully recognized is that zoning is in effect a land tax. When we say you can do this on a particular parcel, but you can't do 4 times as much, that is effectively holding down the price, the value of that land. In effect, it's a land tax. And when a municipality is in a position to increase the allowable density on that site, my argument is that the municipality is under no obligation at all to ensure the wealth is quadrupled by the land speculator or the landowner, but rather they have the opportunity to stream a large portion of that increase in land value towards social ends. Now, we do that in Vancouver. We do it ineffectively, I have long argued, but we do that in Vancouver. We have said if we're going to change a zone on a particular parcel, there's going to be what we call a land lift. And we're going to take 80% of that land lift value as a tax. They don't call it a tax. They call it a community amenity contribution, but it's a tax. They're going to take 80% of that and we're going to use it to social purpose, some of which goes to affordable housing. That's what we do in Vancouver. A lot of California municipalities, when they rezone for higher density in areas that they have an urban renewal plan for, require, they have inclusive zoning ordinances that say as a condition of this new zoning, you have to give us back 20 or 15% or 25% affordable housing units that will be deeded to a nonprofit agency and made permanently affordable. I'll give you a couple of other examples, but I also know that in Boise, you're doing, in a very limited way, some similar things. Here, my argument is we all, in order to solve this problem, need to get much more serious about the land value that we're leaving on the table and how we have both the right and the opportunity as regulators to insist that if we're going to create all this new value through our public action, we also have an obligation to stream that towards the problem that new value creation is causing, which is a lack of affordability. I hope that makes sense. I've been thinking about it for so long, it makes sense to me, and I try to explain it as simply as I can. I know it's hard to get your brain around, and I shouldn't be arrogant because it took me 30 years to figure this stuff out, and I was looking at it every day. Anyway, simple diagram. Before rezoning, land price $1 million per square foot. Interior price of that built building is $1,000. And lo and behold, after you rezone, suddenly the land gets sold for $4 million, and the price per interior square foot is still $1,000. So you have more building on the site, which is good for a variety of reasons. Density is a good thing. But the people who bought into that thing are still looking at a two-bedroom unit in a fourplex now that cost them just as much as the single-family home that might have been there before. We have lots of examples of upzoning where they tear down the existing house and put up a duplex or a fourplex, and the total cost of each unit is actually higher than the purchase price of the original home. The exaggeration of land price inflation in Vancouver is a wonder to behold. It just takes your breath away. Here's one site that was upzoned in, to be fair, a downtown area where it's appropriate to have very high density, but this was a strip commercial building, the White Spot, which is our own local version of like a McDonald's, a slightly upscale McDonald's. And you can see the picture of it on the right-hand side. And it's 2.5 acres. It's not very much land for $250 million, which would be about 200 million US these days, which is still a lot of money. The key figure that I've outlined there in the red box below it, it doesn't matter what the sale price is. What really matters to the developer is $650 per buildable square foot. So no matter where you are in Vancouver, it's $615 per buildable square foot. Whether it's a single family home, a fourplex, an apartment building, that's the number. And that number is established by what the city says you can put on that land. So every time the city says we can double or we can multiply by a factor of 10 that 1,000 square feet of initial authority, you're generating that same $615 per buildable square foot times 10, which is a lot of money for just 1 square foot of dirt. Now yours is probably going to be lower because yours is not quite as exaggerated and you don't have 30 years of out of control land price inflation, but this is where you're heading. So my conclusion is this. Given slow wage growth and the hyperinflation of urban land price, there is no way for the housing market to supply homes in the way it has done in the past during our lifetimes, for sure, post-war era kids that we all are. Only zoning controls designed to stream speculative value into affordable homes can supply housing security for average wage earners. And I say, don't just zone for affordability and insist on it. And if anybody's inclined to call me a socialist, that's fine. But I'm basically with Henry George. Henry George was very unusual because he was dismissed by the socialists and he was dismissed by the capitalists because he said that capital and labor are on the same side. There would be plenty for everybody to share if it wasn't for the fact that urban land is absorbing all that value. And he, along with Adam Smith, separated urban land as not capital. It's not capital. It's a third category, he insisted. There is capital and labor, and then there is urban land. And under present circumstances, I have given up on the idea, given global asset price inflation and increasing inequality, that there's any way we can supply housing to our wage earners who need it, unless we figure out a stream that asset value into affordable housing. And I'll end with a few examples of how to do that. Famous global example is Vienna. They started doing exactly what I'm talking about in the 1920s, which gave them time to create a city where 55% of all their housing is non-market housing. I use the word non-market housing advisedly because I'm not talking about public housing, which has a very bad reputation in the United States, and deservedly so for many reasons. Non-market housing is a much bigger category, which includes co-op housing, condominium housing on land trust land, on leased land. It includes nonprofit housing corporations that agree to rent out their units at a fixed ratio to local wages forever. There's a million different categories of non-market land, and Vienna has every single one of them. This one is a building, very typical building, built in the 20s. This one was built in the 80s, very unusual and beautiful expressionist design. I'm only giving you those two examples to show you the wild and wide variety of affordable housing, which prevents the kind of housing precarity we're experiencing in most of our cities in the United States, our so-called successful cities like San Francisco, with I don't know how many, are they up to 12,000 homeless now? Los Angeles, are they up to 20,000 homeless now? Here, there's 50% of the people, 55% of the people live in non-market housing. And the interesting thing about the non-market housing in Vienna is because the non-market housing sector is bigger than the market housing sector, and there's still 45% of people buy their own homes, and I suppose love the equity gains. But because the non-market housing sector is so big, it creates a dampening effect on the market. So that if you want to rent a market unit in Vienna, it's only a quarter of the price of a similar market rental unit in the city of Paris. That also applies if you want to buy an apartment. If you want to buy a market apartment, it's a quarter of the price of a similar market apartment in the city of Paris. So my last major example here is Cambridge, Massachusetts, place that I know quite well growing up near it. And my daughter's actually an elected official there. She's on the city council and was instrumental, therefore, in getting this ordinance passed. Cambridge has done something that is the first in the nation. It is a citywide affordable housing overlay district, which means They didn't change any of the zoning. They didn't increase density, any particular area or citywide. What they did was to have an alternative layering, an overlay zone, which sent you down a different path if you owned a parcel and wanted to develop it. If you own a parcel and you want to develop it, you can use this different path and you can get double the density, no matter what the existing density is. But in return, you have to guarantee that 100% of all those new units would be affordable. And they clearly define what affordability means. It starts at the upper end at 80% of median family wages. So that's the most you can make to get into one of these buildings. And then it ratchets down from there to 30% of median income. And those 30%ers would likely have Section 8 vouchers to support the building and to make the numbers work. Of course, it's complicated enough, as these things really are, but you get the gist of it. If you want to just do the normal thing and keep your fourplex or whatever the allowable density currently allows, go right ahead. But if you want to take this other avenue, it creates this obligation to ensure 100% affordability. Now, what's the relationship of that to land value? This is the secret sauce. This overlay district was initiated by the non-market housing providers, the charitable nonprofit housing providers, who said, don't increase density because we can't compete with the for-profit developers. If you could do this instead? If you could do this, something like this overlay, it was actually their suggestion, we could compete and our numbers would work. It would not require taxpayer subsidy. The fact that we can go in and get that land at its existing price rather than its elevated price means that we can purchase those parcels. And with the rents we assume at 80% and below of median, we can make the project numbers work and have enough money to pay off the construction and the land price and the ongoing maintenance for that building. And what's neat about that is that if the city can continue to do that, they, like Vienna, will have a housing stock in time where at least 50% of it, hopefully, in time, it's not going to be done tomorrow, that's for sure. At least 50% of it would be pegged to the wages of the people who live there, which is good for the economy. It makes a more vibrant economy if your workers can live there, afford to live there. A lot of places, Vancouver and Cambridge are similar because you can't get people to work in the restaurants because they can't afford to live in the city. Not to mention hospital orderlies and the people who stock your grocery shelves, solid Americans who used to be able to afford a 5-room ranch out in the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s who are crowded together, sharing, bedrooms in places like Cambridge and unable to have a family because forget about it. Birth rates are dropping precipitously as a consequence of this financial strain, but don't get me started on that one. So that's I've said enough about that. There's this stigma around public housing, and Cambridge did an awfully good job of doing architectural demonstrations of what these density buildings would look like. This is very crucial. It took 2 years of talking to citizens to get citizens to agree, because at first they thought, oh my God, my property values are going to go down and all that. The usual anxieties, which are understandable. And it took a long time to convince property owners that these buildings would be an enhancement to your neighborhood, but also, most importantly, these are going to be affordable for your sons and daughters and the service workers who you need to keep in your community. And eventually, that argument is what turned the tide politically. And remember, there's no taxpayer subsidy in this. You know, one of my reservations about Biden's new housing plan, I appreciate the fact he's calling housing infrastructure, which it should be, and it is. Unfortunately, in the past, federal money that just goes into a local housing market tends to be just another factor that inflates local land prices and ends up the lion's share of that taxpayer money goes in the pockets of land speculators rather than into the people, rather than enhancing the lives of the people who need the housing. If you don't want to go all the way to 100% Portland in one that I don't favor as much, but you know, it's good. 50% non-market housing instead of 100%. Similar citywide overlay zoning project. Now, these new affordable units in both Cambridge and Portland, in order to ensure that they will be permanently affordable, typically need to go to non-market owners. The buildings can be what we call in Vancouver stratified or turned into condominiums, and one or two or three of them can be sold to a nonprofit provider, or the whole building can be developed by a nonprofit provider and they can sell into the market half the units in the case of Portland. It's important though to have legal constriction on the units. And the last thing to say, it's not impossible to have in this non-market mix housing like co-op housing that builds equity, that the money you put in when you move out of the house, you get that and maybe some more back, depending on how the co-op is structured. So it's not an entirely non-ownership opportunity. And again, I wish the housing market would work in a way that 80% of Americans could afford to own their own market home. But I think those days are gone unless we see a major global economic collapse like the Depression. That's going to bring in a whole set of other problems that we don't want to confront. And I don't know about NeighborWorks, but I noticed in your town you do have nonprofit providers. So I guess my final recommendation is that in the context of talking about, if there's interest in talking about what I'm talking about here in terms of only upzoning in return for affordability, key players end up being these very credible and competent nonprofit housing providers. They're developers. And in the case of Vienna, what happened, which was very interesting, is when the whole system shifted over to the majority of buildings being built as non-market housing, a lot of the market developers ended up switching to develop non-market housing. Because if you have a construction industry and a development industry in your community, which you do, you know, basically they want their 15% on the construction side. So if you can set up a, you know, basically a risk-free real estate deal where it's going towards a nonprofit secured final result, you can take advantage of their capabilities and hire them, or some might switch over, or new development corporations might grow up in response. Builders might become developers in response to this new opportunity. The builders becoming developers is one that I'm particularly enthusiastic about, because a lot of the best projects that I've seen of this nature are relatively small. They're not high rises. They're not 100 units. They're like 8 units or even 6 buildings that are wood frame that fit in quite nicely into existing neighborhoods, co-op buildings, and so forth. So
Dr.
I'll stop there.
I was gonna say, we don't have too much time left for questions and discussion. So I wanted to thank you for that presentation. It was pretty sobering. I have to say, one point I wanted to make is I think your chart of Boise housing costs ended at 2019, and we've had this massive surge in the last couple years. And so I think the last number that I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, I thought it was $457,000 is the average cost of a housing now in Boise, or a house in Boise, which has gone up dramatically. Also, I thought your point was well taken about the added value via zoning and entitlements. And so I'm sure folks know that right now Boise and Ada County are both overhauling their zoning code, also called the development code, or also called the development rule book. And so one of the things that's likely to happen is a massive upzone. And so giving away all this, value to the developer, and also in that process, losing the leverage and negotiation that we used to have when developers would ask for a rezone, to ask for something else in exchange, right? For something in the public good in exchange for this added value,
Right.
So I'm just setting those as kind of like some frameworks for the discussion, and then just open up the conversation for folks who want to ask questions. We'll put us into a gallery view. So if folks want to turn their cameras on, or if they want to raise their hand, ask questions in the chat, I'll try to call on you. And maybe Brian wants to jump in with some thoughts as well. Hi, Brian. I think you're unmuted. Yes. Okay. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I was just fascinated by the difference between, and I read it in your book, but the difference between Portland and Cambridge, namely the overlay versus Portland did it through straight up use allowance in the zoning code. Is that right, Patrick?
Yeah, basically, you can think of them both as citywide overlays, but the big difference is the difference between 100% requirement and a 50% requirement. And Portland, I felt that because there's a kind of a mixed bag, you can I didn't mention it, but they've blanket increased allowable density. So you can go from 1 dwelling unit to like 3 without affordability. But if you want to go to 6, the 3 additional ones need to be affordable. So it's a little bit of both, whereas Cambridge is much more insistent that any density increase is in return for affordability.
Well, and I think that the way that Cambridge did it with the overlay is particularly savvy in that you don't muddy the waters with eminent domain or private property rights questions,
right?
Where it's just optically more obvious that you're only allowing more right, versus in Portland, it seems like a restriction, right?
Yeah,
with the code.
Yeah. So yeah,
for judicial challenge.
I think that's the logic of it, and the court history at the Supreme Court level for these things, and at various state levels, like California has a long history of trying to finesse all this. When they got into inclusive zoning ordinances and so forth, they had a number of court challenges. Fortunately, most of them survived both the state Supreme Court and the federal Supreme Court, but it's been a hassle to the point where they've kind of moved away from that strategy to something they call nexus studies that have to show the negative impact of high price homes on service workers, basically the people you need in that community. So it's very twisted and complicated, and it's a way to get around this sense that it's a taking. Whereas the Cambridge one, I think it's a very important point you bring up, Brian. Whereas the Cambridge one, it's just like a gift. We don't hurt anybody with this. Go build whatever you're going to build based on the existing zoning. And here's this other avenue, which is a good thing because people can afford it.
Right, and I just want to pop in and say, We just recently here in Boise passed the housing bonus ordinance, which is what it was called, and essentially squandered this opportunity to do something similar to Cambridge. And instead of giving a leg up to nonprofit developers, we essentially gave this extra entitlement to for-profit developers, called something that is essentially market rate housing, or at the very high end of quote unquote affordable housing, and called it at 100% average median income and called it affordable, which it clearly is not. And so, yeah, it was just a very disappointing outcome of, and kind of warping of a good idea to turn into something entirely different. So I'm not sure if there's any political will to go back at it, because we basically did it, but we did it wrong. So it's super unfortunate, and I don't have an explanation for what went so wrong.
I have a quick comment on that one. My own feeling is, politically, we haven't reached a point where recognizing that the housing market cannot produce housing for people below the 50%, people below average wages. Even at 60% average wages, it's a stretch. And, it's only the top 20% who are comfortable in this market. And this is a new thing. The inclusionary zoning ordinances tended to come out of an era where they thought, oh, well, 20% of our people can't afford housing, so we'll target it, in our most ambitious imagination, 20%. But I think that's so 1980. We're in a different world now.
Yeah. Marissa's got her hand up, but if you have a concluding thought, Brian, go for it.
Well, the other thing I wanted to highlight about Patrick's presentation and just add is that we're in the middle of what could be a giant upzone. And we have political actors who believe in the mysticism of the free market, and they believe in the supply demand. And I just wanted to point this out as it relates to what I read in your book, Patrick, and encourage anyone to read the book, because it gives voice to what I think so many all across the country, and particularly here in Boise, are feeling, which is that there are these obscure allusions to simple economic ideas, i.e. supply demand, but it never works out that way. And why? And one of the reasons that I liked is that you really broke it down in simple terms, that something that we should all know, which is when you upzone, or when you increase the allowable use, the right to an allowable use on a property, that immediately increases the value. It has the opposite effect that the supply demand people are telling us, because now all of the land is more valuable to speculators, especially in an increasingly international financialized market. And so could you speak a little bit to that, the upzoning and the allowance of use by right?
You've hit the nail right on the head. That's why I made that point, that the problem is land, and land is never mentioned. For example, even today, USA Today had an article about the incredible rise in prices of housing across the United States. And the absolute conviction in the article was, oh, there's just not enough supply. There's not enough supply. And as you pointed out, the people in stressed communities like your own are intuitively understanding that's not what is happening here. It's not about supply. Unfortunately, those of us who, like myself and yourself, who are convinced that it's not about supply, are operating against a very strong received wisdom that the laws of supply and demand are sacrosanct and true at every level. And that's why in my journey, I had to rediscover the work of Henry George, great American economist, who identified land as the issue that got in the way of workers and capitalists creating great cities, which in my short exposure to Boise, it looks like that at least was a great American city, like many, particularly on the West Coast, were great American cities. So, and the issue is land, and it's very difficult to separate the question of land and the monopolistic way that there's no other word for it. They're not making any more land. And urban land is a limited commodity. In my book, I talk about how we overwhelmed it for a while when we built all these freeways out to the middle of nowhere, which opened up the supply temporarily until we got caught up with congestion and all these other constraints, which put us back in the same situation. So we were able to ignore it for a while. Post-war era, we could ignore the problem of land, which was a very big deal up until the Depression. The price of land was very much discussed politically in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and as well as the last 2 decades of the 19th century. The problem of the land baron and land wealth was the critical political conversation, but we don't have that conversation anymore.
Marissa, did you have a question?
Or just a comment. Laura, I remember when the housing bonus was going through, that a bunch of the city council members, they talked about how it wasn't perfect, but they needed to do something. They did say that they would revisit it if they found that it wasn't effective. So maybe we can put some pressure on them to do that. But we did have our zoning rewrite committee meeting today. And one of the things that was brought up, maybe not what they wanted brought up, but one of the things that somebody brought up was with PUD applications, the consultant had a note in there that all amenities for PUDs would be waived if the builder put in or conditioned 10% of the homes to be affordable. And I think it was up to 100% of the AMI. I can't exactly, Richard might remember. But there was quite a bit of pushback from the committee with that, which is encouraging. But as we read through the new code that's presented, I think there probably will be a lot of that sort of thing in there. And anyhow, I just want to say I was going to send some of the articles that you had put on your screenshot through our committee email so that everybody can read them, and maybe we can get a little more pressure to do affordable housing by not just giving away our density and having the affordable housing actually built into the code a bit better than what they're trying to do right now.
Yeah, for folks who may not know, a PUD is a planned unit development. And so what the consultant to the city on this overhaul of the zoning code is proposing is to having lower standards essentially for low income housing, or what's affordable housing, which flies in the face of the Fair Housing Act and the furthering fair housing stipulation in the Fair Housing Act. So yeah, it seems very concerning that that's what they're doing sort of out the gate, is talking about how can we build affordable housing but make it less appealing and have less amenities for poor people, right? So
yeah.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, in the book, there's a chapter on the kind of tragedy of American affordable housing efforts, basically between the 1930s and the 1980s. And one of the traps that they fell into was doing it on the cheap, and provoked by the same political forces that you're describing.
Yeah.
And there again, my analysis is fixed. I'm all about land price, and maybe not everybody agrees, but I certainly agree with myself that, any discussion about amenities, whether it's a shuffleboard court or plantings or a gazebo or a little park or a plaza to sit in, is ridiculous, because that's like 5% of the cost. You get people talking about reducing permit lag time, immediate approvals and all this stuff, and get rid of the granite countertops. This is all those things combined is 5-10% of the cost of the whole deal. If you really want to look at, it's like Jesse James said, why do I rob banks? Why do you rob banks? He says, oh, that's because the money is. When you look at the deal, that's why I bored you with all those maps. showing land price inflation. When you look at the deal, the real issue there is the land price, and it's not going to help to get rid of a few shrubs.
Right.
Well, and I would just add, well, there's a couple points, but in your book, again, which everyone should read, you talk about segregation issues and how we need these mechanisms that you're talking about to really head off segregation issues, because that's what we're seeing with the belligerent free market right now is, and we're seeing that in Boise, is the consolidation of affordable housing on lands that are devalued because all the unwanted people are already there. So we'll keep shoving and displacing people into those areas in high concentrations. And so there are social justice issues, which I think are very fascinating. But also the overlay and the land trust and the nonprofit mechanisms really are unique in their capacity to integrate across the entire community versus discrete projects that by virtue of budget, stochastic federal infusions of money, whether it be COVID money or whatever, are always going to hyper agitate or catalyze further segregation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why I'm so glad you made that point, Brian. That's why in this book and in general, I strongly advocate the powers that localities have as compared to federal government or even state governments to just dump money onto the thing, and necessarily it'll end up segregating people, which it has continued to do. Section 8 vouchers still do the same thing. Tax credits for affordable housing at the federal level still are a segregationist thing. But if you can get land use policy, which is almost the only power that localities really have, that is, I think, the secret sauce on this whole question of land value. And if you can use the levers of local land use policy and zoning approval to meet your social ends in an intelligent way that works for your community at a scale that's appropriate to your community need, then you're laughing, I think. It seems somewhat utopian, which is why I put that example of Vienna in, to show a place that's been doing that for so long and what it looks like. I also didn't mention that Vancouver, for all of its problems up until the 1980s, was producing thousands and thousands of co-op housing units every year, such that now 15% of the 600,000 people who live in the city live in co-op housing in various parts of the city. You don't know that they're co-op housing when you drive by. Some of them are architecturally very elegant. So, and that comes from having, local, I don't want to sound too utopian about it, but that comes, I think it's more likely to occur if you have local small scale developers. That's why I mentioned that idea of builders. And that's why I mentioned Cambridge's care in doing the architectural expressions of what it would look like in your neighborhoods, and brought that in as part of the political process so that these things weren't segregated and people in various parts of the community felt more comfortable about having that element, which previously they might have been anxious about, an accepted part of their community. Particularly, I think the politics of the current circumstance is different. It used to be that just the black and brown and the poor were the ones who needed that housing. But now it's our kids who need that housing if they don't have access to equity. It's really at least 50% of Americans, most of whom are white, most of whom end up in normal middle-class jobs, most of whom have college loans that they're trying to pay off at the same time they're trying to get into housing. And this is a totally different situation than the so-called civil rights era or the Depression.
Yeah. Richard, did you have a question? I see your hand raised.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. A great presentation. And like Marissa, who spoke earlier, I'm also on one of 20 citizens on the zoning committee advisory for the rewrite. And I've, kind of come to that kind of conclusion that really we need to negotiate in some way, either on individual rezones, as we can do now if there's the political will to do so, or in one kind of larger sweeping way that the housing bonus that Lori mentioned should have done, but it all depends on those numbers. And if you don't get the numbers right, then it just doesn't work. So what we've been hearing, well, so one, I don't believe that this is necessarily the case, but the city's belief is that inclusionary zoning is not legal in Idaho. And so they're not going to directly go that route, it seems. And so then there is still the possibilities of these housing bonus type deals, or like what Cambridge did, I guess, if you call it the appropriate thing. It's a bonus, it's not required inclusionary zoning.
That's right.
But what we've heard from our consultant is we hear, well, don't ask for too much, because Philadelphia keeps getting brought up. Philadelphia asked for too much. They asked for too much affordable housing. I don't know what they asked for, but presumably it was more than our 100% AMI for 20% of the units at 30 years. And you ask for more than that, and nobody's going to build anything, is kind of the answer that we get. So I'm curious if you would have a response for that. I mean, part of the issue I think for us is we don't really use much data, as far as I can understand. In your book, I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but I certainly will. But yeah, so go ahead if you can give me a response.
Yeah, the developer consultants and the engineering consultants will always say, well, you can't, don't push. The reason they will do that is because they think that basically the cost envelope is relatively fixed. And the component that they think is quite fixed is what they call the residual value of the land. After the cost of the building and the profit for the developer and the permitting costs and the financing costs and all that stuff, the sale price generates what's called a residual price for the land, and it's always based on the market. Whatever the market is will generate the residual price for the land. It all starts with how much a square foot of building is worth in your community, and now you know it's worth too much. It's being sold in the market for too much. The answer to your question, the direct answer to your question, is what Cambridge did, and the way I would phrase it, which is relatively simple bumper sticker, is you really have, the value of the citywide overlay is that it has a greater potential of what I call disciplining the land market. In other words, the land market is comprised of a whole bunch of actors out there who know that Joe sold his land for X amount and Pete sold his land for X amount for development. And that's what they know is the value of their land, which is the residual value that happens after all these other costs and blah, 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 blah. They know that's the price. And if the city comes in and in Cambridge's case, and puts this overlay on, even though it doubles the density, they know that it will take time, and they're experiencing this now because they just did the ordinance 6 months ago, to discipline the land market. It takes a certain amount of time to convince property owners that the price they anticipated from a doubling of density is not going to happen because of thus and so, because the affordability requirement changes the way that the project pencils out. So it's better to do the citywide one than the spot zone one, because spot zones have that problem of just, when you start to focus on the one parcel, that inflates the price. And by the time you get to do the project, the price of the land is already way up there. And, they're going to say, we can't make the numbers work. We have to walk away from this deal. The developers only walk away from deals because they can't make money. But in the context that I'm talking about, if the land price inflationary factors are mitigated such that the developer can go and knock on Joe's door and say, I can only give you $10 million for this 2 acres. And Joe says, it's worth way more than that. Says, well, that guy's going to walk away. Pete's going to come up and say, I can only give you $2 million because otherwise the whole deal isn't going to work. Eventually that land is going to sell. Somebody's going to sell. And then once that first one is sold at that price, that becomes the new land price benchmark. So that is what I would say in answer to that. The bumper sticker is, we need to discipline the land market. The land market is out of control. And what we're doing is making it worse, not better.
Yes, great point. I was curious if you would address urban renewal districts. So we have independent urban renewal agency that is basically self-perpetuating, and they are just declaring vast acreages of the city as urban renewal districts, which for folks who may not know, essentially that means that taxpayers with public money subsidize the amenities, infrastructure, and other sort of amenities on that property. The taxes are locked in at the point at which it's created an urban renewal district for 20 years. And then all the services that new district needs are basically backfilled by taxpayers. And it's basically like, I mean, I think about it as like basically public subsidized gentrification. And it is like taxpayers paying for enhancements on the property value for a private developer, which is just crazy. Well, and one last thing I want to say about it is it's supposed to be, the whole purpose of it is as a remedy to blight. And I've heard many people say there's literally no blight in Boise, right? It's not like, you know, an urban disinvested city. So like why we even have them as a tool, I don't know. But I was just curious if you might address urban renewal districts in relationship to land value.
Well, I'm not a fan generally. They come in different stripes, so I hesitate to speak specifically to the Boise situation, but all across the United States, urban renewal among people in my discipline it's not favored because it tends to approach the issue from a kind of blighted perspective, and you've touched on it. You know, the assumption that a certain area is blighted is challengeable, and it's led to terrible mistakes, such as downtown Boston. They destroyed an area 5 times the size of the North End. Now the North End is a place where tourists come from all over the world to visit. You know, now you have this monstrosity of Boston City Hall. It's just like you want to run away when you see it from 6 blocks away. Don't get me started on that one. The more successful ones are let's not call it a renewal district because the word itself is wrong. Something along the lines of a revival district where, you know, there might be certain disinvested properties in a certain area where reinvestment in those properties is merited. Sometimes formerly industrial districts where they have big footprint buildings are a good candidate for city coming in with new infrastructure, new block, extending the city blocks into those areas and eventually selling off parcels. The ones that do that the best are use a light touch, saving almost everything that can be saved. And you know, in the example I've given you of the giant industrial parcel, you know, basically the street infrastructure is what's lacking. So you put in new blocks and new streets and new sidewalks. And then the best way to finance it is through tax increment financing. And also the city sale of those parcels. You know, if those are developed, if those are sold off incrementally as the place takes off, the city can recoup its initial expenses. And then I don't know if Idaho has legal tax increment financing, but that's an avenue where the expenditures that you put up front are returned off the tax receipts of that new investment. And I think the best deal would be for the city to get in there early and be the landowner. Because again, coming back to the issue of land, you know, urban renewal districts often give incredible benefits to the people who get this land given away to them virtually for free. And by the time the project is done, the value of that land is tremendously inflated, such that their profits really come from the free land, not from the building they built. So that's what I would say. And the advantage of the strategy that we've all been talking about here today is that it doesn't segregate things into just one part of the city, and nothing happens anywhere else. You don't get an evolution of other parts of the city to create a vehicle of entry, if you will, for people who need housing, who work in your grocery store, you know, whose kids go to your own school, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, and I would just add, well, first, the blight standard is a couple dislodged roofing shingles, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's to get the subsidies going on TIF for whoever the big developer is. That's in Boise. That's been my experience with Boise. But just as easily, you could wield that mechanism, and this is a political question. We could wield that mechanism to finance and facilitate the mechanisms that you're talking about with public land trusts, with you know, and especially in a Dillon rule state like Idaho, where the state legislature did grant those authorities, specifically the Urban Renewal Authority, came straight from the legislature, which it has to in Idaho. We have that authority. We just don't have the political will with the politicians that the mayor appoints to the urban renewal boards. And instead, it's a revolving door with the developers, which becomes a problem, which, to the question of political will, like you're talking about, Patrick, and again, your book, what strikes me is that these ideas would be unfamiliar or seem utopian when the police, all you're describing is the police power, which clearly we have. It's their job to protect us from the belligerence.
That's right.
From the excesses of a free market. That's their job. That's their role.
That's right. That's right. And for the rest of you who may not be as familiar as Brian on this, the police power has 100 years of certification at the Supreme Court level, which is basically established as a mandate, the requirement of cities to make their generally land use decisions around what is in the best interest of the health, safety, and welfare of their own municipal citizens. There's nothing in that decision about ensuring the maximum profits to whoever might own a piece of land in the future. It doesn't show up in those judgments.
Yeah.
And all you're really saying is that where those landowners ask for more, it's the job of the politicians, the representatives of the people, to remember the people that are their constituents and say they need to be a part of the value that's realized in the extension of more rights than you already have.
That's right. And the other legalistic way to think about this is that local municipalities are not obligated to open their arms to global investment to the point where to the point where all the existing citizens are at least damaged in some measurable way and might be forced out of their own community. You know, that's obviously absurd to think that that's our obligation, but that's exactly what we're doing.
Totally.
Well, and I'll just add that I'm one of those folk that used to live on the north end Boise, which is like the premier real estate, right? Until my landlord, who was out of state, realized what was happening with our market, because I tried to get the landlord to sign I'm willing to sign a 5-year lease. Nope, they increased the rent. I got displaced. And thank God I've got parents who, you know, grew up in the 70s and 80s.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's exactly what's happening.
So we're over time. I am going to ask one more question and then give folks like another chance to raise their hand and ask a question. But we have a question that came in through the chat. So in Boise, we're being presented with a choice, either sprawl or density. Pick one or the other. There is an inverse relationship between the two. There is no middle ground. Yet my last flight over Toronto seemed to show a patchwork of density centers throughout the metro area, with multiple concentrations of density and lesser density spatially distributed. So is this a false choice, sprawl or density, with no middle ground between these two polar extremes?
Yeah, it is a false choice, and it's become quite popular to talk about the missing middle these days, which is a density level between single family homes and tower blocks. Vancouver, because it didn't have the same degree of sprawl as US metropolitan areas, has more than the average amount of missing middle density, as does Toronto. What we're finding up here, unfortunately, is that in the absence of requirements for affordability, missing middle density in existing neighborhoods can be an inflationary force rather than an unreservedly positive force. It can be a factor of gentrification. So my recommendation now, which departs from my recommendations 20 years ago, is that basically any density needs to be, in our situation, needs to be conditioned. Any increases in density needs to be conditioned on affordability at some level. Figure out the numbers, and to do otherwise is basically opening yourself up to gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's been pretty much the mantra of Vanishing Boise since we started it. But yeah, it's pretty difficult to break through the cacophony of it's just a supply and demand issue. There's just millions of dollars being spent to perpetuate this false narrative, and it's easy for people to understand. So for folks who don't even recognize the complexity of housing and economic models, it just is like, you know, that thing that you learned in Econ 101. It's easy to understand. And so yeah, it's definitely challenging to kind of break through and have people recognize the deeper complexity. And yeah, so we're still plugging away here. I want to thank you. Well, actually, I guess I gave folks an opportunity to have one last round of questions. So anyone wants to raise their hand now.
I try to keep my answers shorter.
So I'm not seeing anything. So I guess with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Condon, for joining us tonight. It was really fantastic for you to, oh, there's a question. So I want to honor this person who is raising their hand. So Pam, if you want to join in with your audio and pose your question to Dr. Condon.
That wasn't a question, that was a hand clapping.
Oh, it was a hand clapping. Oh, okay. I don't
Sorry.
know that.
Thank you, Pam.
Okay,
Thank you,
yes.
Pam.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting.
Thank you, Pam. It's been my pleasure.
I have one question. I can't get the hand to raise.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Jody.
It's related to this, but I just kind of thought what's kind of disconcerting to me here is that we see like literally acres and acres and acres of apartments going up in like one development. You know, they're all, you know, just acres of buildings. They're all the same, you know, floor plan, the same building. And it just feels like they're like people farms or people jails or something. I didn't know, you know, just what's the social, you know, impact of these just giant, like literally like thousands of people in just this one apartment complex. And it just seems like a weird social experiment right now.
Yeah, that's happening all over the this side of the planet for sure. As inequality becomes more and more exaggerated, people who are making what used to be considered average wages, capable of buying a house and a new Chevy every few years, are no longer able to do that. And that's generated a market for in what is in many communities an unprecedented home type, and it's very difficult to fight against that one. And it is destructive in terms of the segregation of people into those locations, how those locations are incompatible with family development. It's not a place where you can imagine raising 2 or 3 or 4 kids. And they are what ends up being profitable at these very high land prices. You know, it's the model. It's very factory generated, and it's in conformance to zoning codes that say two parking spaces per apartment unit. So that's why the buildings end up getting surrounded by a big parking lot rather than green or playgrounds and so forth. So, you know, my response to that is that small is beautiful. And if you could get a handle on this land price question, it does open up the design opportunities. That's why I've left the slides with Lori. That's why I gave you a quick glance at what Cambridge has done by spending a lot of time showing what can go into existing neighborhoods or next to existing neighborhoods and what might be a vacant lot that is compatible with that neighborhood and doesn't stigmatize those people and becomes a good place for families. And the final rents for them can be affordable for those families as long as you can control land price through insisting on affordable homes in those new developments. So, you know, it might sound utopian to think that it can be done, but it can be done. It can be done. And the last comment I almost forgot to make was Boise. Boise is really super interesting because you're a relatively small community in comparison to LA or San Francisco and places like that. You have probably you might actually have the most dramatic home price pressures. You have a pattern of habitation that the bones of your community is tremendous. So you have a lot to build on that, you know, suburban sprawl locations don't have. It's a beautiful place with the river. What, you know, used to be called, you know, the Forest City or something like that.
City of Trees.
City of Trees. So it's tucked up against the mountains. Unbelievable place with so much going for it, which is being basically sold off on the chopping block to international capital right now. So you have a lot at stake, much more at stake than many other communities, and a much more manageable size in terms of the problem. I wouldn't want to be Garcetti, the mayor of, you know, Los Angeles, trying to fix this problem. But I'd much prefer being the mayor of Boise and trying to fix your problem. I think it's manageable within a few months if you could get the political consensus.
Well, that's a hopeful note to end on. I appreciate that. It's hard to find the hopeful notes in the midst of all this sometimes. So thanks again. I want to remind everybody that Dr. Condon's giving away his new book for free, and he's linked linked it in the comments in the chat. So go ahead and click on that. It's a pretty great read. And then we are going to probably continue doing these live streams, but I think we're going to scale it back to like every 2 weeks instead of every week. And for the very next one, we actually are going to try to put together a program on urban renewal districts. So if folks are baffled by that, which is super understandable, they're very complicated, we'll try to explain and demystify them. So please tune in. That would be May 6th for that next one. So. Okay, thanks for tuning in and hanging in there, and we'll see you May 6th. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jody. good to see you on here, even if I can't.
Yeah.
see you.
Well, you don't want to see me right now, right? Like eating dinner, you know. So
Hey, Lori. Hey, Lori.
Yeah,
Can you post the link to his book? It's not showing up on my chat. I think maybe
I'll
because
post
I
it on the
wasn't-
Vanishing Boise Facebook page. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Good night.
I'm
Thank
I'm
you.
not seeing
you,
it
Brian.
either.